There was a roiling up of tensions.
The rise of meanness and snark and sarcasm has fully penetrated our national politics.
We are a country that stands united in condemning hate and evil.
There is not a liberal America and a conservative America. There is the United States of America.
There's never been a time when they've been given half a chance that they've ever let their country down.
Regardless of race, ethnicity, religion, or political affiliation, we are all human.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here. This is the 7th Annual National Agenda Speaker Series, brought to you by the University of Delaware's Center for Political Communication, with support from the Office of the Provost and the College of Arts and Sciences. Tonight's event is also co-sponsored by the Department of English. I'm Dr. Lindsay Hoffman. I'm the Director of the National Agenda Program and the Associate Director of the CPC. This year, we're delving into the many divides facing Americans in 2017. With nationally known speakers, including one former Vice President of the United States that you might recognize, we're going to explore the many divides that exist, including gender, geography, religion, partisan, cultural, and more. We encourage students, faculty, staff, and community members to engage in this semester-long conversation. We've already heard from a first-time congressional candidate who was motivated to run based on her experience with online harassment. You can watch Brianna Wu's talk at cpc.udel.edu/national agenda. Coming up, we'll speak with a Muslim journalist, a stand-up comedian with Cuban roots, 2 former congressmen from opposite sides of the aisle, and of course, Joe Biden. You can find the full schedule at udel.edu/national agenda. And if you appreciate these events, please sign up for our email list right outside in the foyer before you leave. And consider supporting the CPC so we can continue to bring you this high quality programming. You can just go to cpc.udel.edu/support. Tonight's event is free and open to the public, like all National Agenda events, to create a space for thoughtful dialogue. I encourage audience participation, both from the audience here in Mitchell Hall and via Twitter. Just tweet at UdelAgenda to join the discussion. But before we get started, I'd like to remind our audience that civil and respectful dialogue is expected. It's vital to the success of National Agenda. While we may seem more divided than at any time in our memories, we are still bound together as Americans and as human beings. 2017 brings us an era of great discord, overt racism, and violence, and the seeming inability to bridge our differences. But it is possible. That's what we do here at National Agenda. We demonstrate civil dialogue so you too can bring that civility to your conversations. Our goal is to tamper down heat, to abate the anger, to recede from hate. Instead, we hope to inspire curiosity, foster compassion, and offer real solutions for constructive communication. So let's all agree to be candid, but courteous of each other's views tonight. We're also a little more interactive this year. When we begin the audience Q&A, we'll be using a catch box. This is a microphone that we are literally going to toss back and forth throughout the audience. So we'll have 2 students volunteers in each of these center aisles who will facilitate. I also want to point out that this year is new for our Voices of the Divide audio essay contest. It examines the impact of a nation divided on UD students. Do you think that America has become more polarized? Have you ever felt marginalized? How has that experience shaped your own life and the lives of those around you? How have you managed those challenges? With support from UD's library, the Writing Center, and many other units on campus, we've got everything you need to put together a high-quality audio essay. And as an added bonus, there are cash prizes. But tonight, let's get to our speaker. David Joy is a North Carolina-based author writing quote-unquote Appalachian noir, dark, gritty stories with realistic characters rooted in Jackson County, North Carolina. Joy's first novel, Where All Light Tends to Go, debuted to great acclaim and was named an Edgar finalist for Best First Novel. His stories and creative nonfiction have appeared in Draft Horse, Smoky Mountain Living, and Wilderness House Literary Review, among others. He's also the author of the memoir, Growing Gills, A Fly Fisherman's Journey. His most recently published book, The Weight of This World, is, in part, about a veteran who returns to a changed hometown, devastated by drugs and a lack of jobs. I'm not ordinarily a reader of fiction, I have to admit to you, but I simply could not put these books down. They were stunning and entertaining and fascinating reads. If you enjoy his talk tonight, I encourage you to purchase a signed copy of one or both of his books in the lobby outside from the UD bookstore. He's here tonight to shed light on the geographic divides facing the nation, how we often misperceive people in different parts of the country, and what it means to feel connected to a place that is characterized by ugly stereotypes that often inaccurately emphasize ignorance, a lack of personal responsibility, and violence. In many ways, Joy's writing reflects exactly what we encourage students here to submit to our audio essay contest. He writes from a very personal perspective to address what divides us and also what brings us together. So please join me in giving a big blue hen welcome to author David Joy. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm just going to sit down. I learned early on that I'm so tall that if I stand up, it's a lot further to fall than if I sit down. You know, it's a short fall from here to the ground. I want to thank everybody for coming, and especially the University of Delaware for having me. I thought I would read a little bit tonight from an essay, which is kind of how Lindsay wound up finding me. I wrote an essay for the Bitter Southerner, wound up, getting some traction and getting picked up in different places. Typically, I write fiction. I write novels. That's how I make my living. I live on a farm. I do farm work, and I write novels. So typically when I write an essay, it's either because I feel really moved to do so, or it's because I'm pissed off. With the essay that she read, I was pissed off. With the essay I'm going to read from tonight, I think I was angered, but not in the same capacity. And so a lot of times I wind up writing these essays to try and explain something that I think maybe readers are missing. And so I was going to read a little bit from this essay, and it was called One Place Misunderstood, which is a reference to that Eudora Welty line that one place understood helps us understand all places better. But it was originally published in a place called Writer's Bone, which is just a website I really like, and then later on it was picked up by the Huffington Post. But it's I kind of wanted to read it because I think it helps define Appalachia. I think we have a tendency, especially outside of that region, to think of Appalachia as a very small place, and so if you're not from there, if you've never been there, and you hear the word Appalachia, you think of a place about the size of, I don't know, maybe Delaware, versus you're talking about a region that stretches, from Mississippi to New York, a very vast region. And so I think a lot gets lost in the conversation because people don't know how drastically different that place is, how rich it is, how complex it is. So I was going to read a little bit from this. Won't take very long. If you'll bear with me, then we can talk the rest of the time.
Well, and I should clarify, I asked if he could read from some of his work. I'm sort of channeling Terry Gross a little bit here. Like, can you read from your most recent work? So I think his words speak for itself. So I think we'd appreciate it. Thank you.
All right. When I sit down to begin a story, the canvas isn't blank and that there is already a place. There are already mountains and streams and buildings and roads, so that when a character finally arises, that character claws himself from the ground. Because he emerges from that place, he already has a name and an accent and mannerisms that are tied directly to the dirt from which he rose. That place for me is Jackson County, North Carolina. At the same time, I don't write books about Jackson County, nor do I write books about Appalachia. I write stories about desperation. A fellow writer and friend, Brian Panowich, says I write love stories. While I don't necessarily know whether that's true, I know it's a lot closer to the truth than to entertain that my stories are snapshots of a region. I write tragedy. I write the types of stories that I like to read, stories where any hint of privilege is stripped away so that all we are left with is the bitter humanity of it. Stories about lives pinballing between extremes because there is nothing outside of sheer survival. Within those extremes, there is gut-busting laughter and there is heart-wrenching sadness. There is murderous anger and there is lay-down-my-life love. That, for me, is the human condition. Yet because of where my stories are set, I have people all the time, particularly people from outside this region, who ask how my work represents Appalachia. They ask whether the drugs and the violence that I write about are the cold reality of the place where I live, to which I always respond, no more than right here. I once had some ritzy media escort wheeling me around in a Mercedes through some noisy city who asked what people where I'm from thought of my work before stuttering, or can they read? If it had been a man, I might have hit him, but it wasn't, and so I ate it. I let that feeling roll around in the pit of my stomach for a moment, then responded simply, yes, we can read. Then lifted my feet from her floorboard and shook my boots at him. We even have shoes. I can give you a singular image of Jackson County's landscape. Our mountains are steep and almost every road follows water. We split the highest mountain on the Blue Ridge Parkway, Richland Balsam, which is also one of the 20 highest summits in the entire Appalachian chain, with neighboring Haywood County. We're home to the headwaters of 4 rivers, the Tuckasegee, Whitewater, Horse Pasture, and the Chattooga, that being the same Chattooga that Burt Reynolds paddled in Deliverance, but higher up where that river starts is a creek, not down in the hot country running the Georgia-South Carolina line. In summer, the place is eaten with green, so much of it that one of my mentors who came to these mountains from the desert said that she felt strangled by it. In winter, the trees are stripped down to their gray bones, and in that nakedness, you can see the contours of the mountains, the hollers and coves, smoothed and weathered over the past 480 million years. There's some farmland along the river bottoms, but not near as much as, say, Haywood County to our east or Macon County to our west. The land here is too steep for the most part, a place better suited for black bear and deer, turkey and salamanders than people. Drawing a singular image of our people, that's where things get difficult, or rather impossible. I can take you to someone whose ancestors were some of the first to settle here, people with names rooted to this place, names like Hooper and Woodring and Broom and McCall and Dillard and Rice and Messer and Mathis and Farmer and Coward and on till the cows come home. I can introduce you to people who still run bear with Walker hounds and plots, people with wild ramp patches they hold in secrecy as if those onions were as valuable as ginseng. I can take you to front porches where people still gather on Sunday afternoons to pick stringed instruments and sing old ballads and hymns they've memorized like recipes. At the same time, I've sat in a bar in town and listened to reggae band one night, then turned around and heard world-renowned jazz guitarist Freddie Bryant grace the same tiny room the very next. Just a couple of weeks back, I went and listened to a Pulitzer winner read from his work on a Thursday, then went to watch midget wrestling warriors beat the ever-loving hell out of one another in a high school gymnasium 2 nights later. There are hard-working people and there are deadbeats. There are God-fearing people and the godless. There are outlaws and lawmen, just as there are millionaires hitting golf balls on Tom Fazio-designed golf courses just over the ridgeline from people surviving off of mayonnaise sandwiches. All of this is true. All of this is within Jackson County. Come here and I will show it to you. Spend enough time here, keep your eyes and ears open and your mouth closed, and you may come to know this place. Know this place and you know a part of Appalachia. But you will not know Appalachia as a whole any more than I do. This is a region that stretches from the hill country of Mississippi to New York, an area covering 205,000 square miles across 420 counties in 13 states. I know people from Kentucky who will cut you for not pronouncing Appalachia the right way. Appalachia, they'll tell you. But I also know a woman born and raised in McKean County, Pennsylvania, a county just as Appalachian as Jackson, who will tell you her people say Appalachia, that her people don't dig ramps, but they do dig leaks. Jackson County, North Carolina is not the coal fields of Kentucky or West Virginia. Coal isn't destroying our mountaintops. Ours are threatened by unrestricted land development. What passes for mountains in the tip of Alabama would feel flat as a hoe cake to someone who'd never been off the balsams. Trying to unify this region under a singular paradigm is like trying to calculate string theory on an abacus. It's an absurdity. I've lived here most of my life and I can't. As writers, we often stand painting a wall gray while people behind scream, "I love that it's black," or "I hate that it's white." So often readers just don't seem to get it. Recently, a fan from Denmark contacted me to ask about Appalachia following an article that ran in a Danish newspaper, Berlingske, a daily with a circulation of around 100,000. The title of the May 5th, 2016 article loosely translates to "Way Out Where the White, Fat, and Poor Live." In it, the author Paul Hoy used the Roden family massacre in Ohio and the novels of Daniel Woodrell and Donald Ray Pollock to argue that Appalachia is, quote, "a heroless, malnourished, and uneducated America where all of the goodness and normality has been sucked out to leave a tribe of murderous weirdos with rotten teeth," end quote. The bottom line is that someone who reads Daniel Woodrell and asks about Missouri and its Ozarks being a long way from Appalachia, or who reads Donald Ray Pollock and asks how that book captures the Ohioan experience, is asking the wrong questions. These aren't books about the South or about Appalachia. These are books about desperate people who have been backed into a corner and are left with no other option than to fight for their very survival. These are stories that, as Rick Bragg once put it, are about living and dying in that fragile, shivering place in between. That's where the power of writers like Woodrell and Pollock and McCarthy and Larry Brown and William Gay and Ron Rash and Harry Crews has always lain. And that's not an Appalachian story or a Southern story. That's a human story, one that could have just as easily been set in New York City. This is what Eudora Welty meant when she wrote, "One place understood helps us understand all places better." So if you want to know what it's like in Appalachia, read broadly. Read novelists like Silas House and Lee Smith. Read Robert Geip's Trampoline and Crystal Wilkinson's The Birds of Opulence. Read Jeremy Jones' memoir, Bearwalla, A Personal History of a Mountain Homeland, who, by the way, does play the banjo, but who has a full head of teeth and an absolutely wonderful smile. If you want to know about the South, read writers like Jill McCorkle and George Singleton. Read Rick Bragg's All Over But the Shoutin'. Read poetry. For God's sake, read poetry. Read Wendell Berry and Maurice Manning and Jane Hicks and Darnell Arnault and Denton Loving and Rebecca Gale Howell and Frank X. Walker, Ron Houch and Ray McManus, Tim Peeler. But don't think of the people you meet in these books as Appalachian or Southern. To regionalize is so often to marginalize. Instead, see the humanity and question that rather than where they come from. Over and over, we all keep looking for differences, but now more than ever, I think we need to start seeing our similarities. That's the end of that essay.
Thank you.
Yeah. Did you want me to read from this? Okay.
Yeah, I had asked David if he could read from his most recent novel, published novel, The Weight of This World. Some interesting components I found in that book were kind of the struggle of rural white Americans with immigrants and with other people coming in and maybe perceived as taking their jobs. And I thought this was a really insightful section. So again, in Terry Gross's best voice, I'd like you to read. If you can begin on page, actually, what page is that?
I think I got it.
Okay, you got it. Thank you.
Yeah, I think with this book, one of the people was, he worked construction, and so he built houses for a living. And that's very indicative of where I live. Most people either work in some type of construction field if they're from there, or they work in some type of landscaping. And so there was all this money being dumped into the county with part-time residents, typically second and third homeowners, building houses up on the ridgelines. And during the early 2000s, a buddy of mine said, he jokes, he says, we all had $20 bills falling out of our pockets. And that's very much how things were going. But when the bubble burst, you know, and all that money dried up, there was kind of a vacuum left where a lot of these people didn't have jobs. And so this section of the book was kind of referring to that. And this person, you know, thinks a lot of the Hispanics have gotten jobs that maybe he should have gotten. Before the apartments were built, Tommy Presley kept the Mexicans stacked in buses like cordwood. For years, his family had brought the migrants in at seed and harvest, worked them to the bone for wages no white man would have broken a sweat over. They housed the workers in the same buses used to haul them from field to field. That was the start of it. That was when the Mexicans first came to the mountains and to Jackson County. They could just as easily have been Guatemalan or Honduran or Salvadoran or Colombian or anything else, but none of that mattered to people who'd never seen them before. They were Mexicans. They were farm hands who worked spring and fall, and outside of those times were nowhere to be found. Then one year, Tommy Presley got the bright idea to build dormitories that later became apartments. The idea came to him just the same as it had to mill owners who built the houses where the workers lived and paid them in scrip. Build the world they live in, and they wind up handing back the same money they're paid. That was the idea. That's what he'd done, and that's how it started. The problem was that once those Mexicans had places to live that weren't just seasonal, they had to find ways to earn a living outside of farming. Most had trades they'd learned back home, trades like Aiden, who mostly laid rock but could do about anything with his hands. They were stonemasons and plumbers and framers and painters and electricians and roofers and operators, and some hung drywall and some hung gutters and some hung hardy board and some did grading and some poured concrete, and all drank Tecate and shared lunches of beans and spiced meat with tortillas and 2 liters of orange soda. Their work was just the same as any white man's, and they did it for $8 an hour at first, then negotiated to $10, which was still a break because none of the locals would even think of lacing up their boots for anything less than $15. This meant higher margins for contractors, so they came to prefer the work of Mexicans to white men. 2/3 the wages and no need to pay taxes or 1099 them. Done deal. Aiden still found work when the market was strong because there was just that much work to be had. Developments popped up along every ridgeline in Jackson County faster than contractors could pull permits, so fast that the county had to build a second permitting office at the southern end just to try and keep up. But when the market crashed and the plug was pulled and construction sites dried up overnight, leaving houses that were half finished abandoned like the end of the world had come, the white jobs were the first to go, and the Mexicans lost theirs not long after. None of that mattered because they were here by that point, whole families filling every trailer park and apartment slum from Cashers to Cullowhee. Cantinas popped up all over the place, and their parking lots were always filled with foreign cars with South Carolina tags, all of those Mexicans learning quickly that they could register the cars they shared in the state below without a lick of insurance. If one of them crashed drunk at night, he'd pop the tag off with a screwdriver, leave the car in the ditch or wrapped around a tree, run like hell, and have the same plate on a new ride by morning. All sheriff deputies had were blood trails that trickled out away from the crash. Nobody to arrest, nobody to charge, just a mess to clean up. There were some jobs starting to pop back up now, 2 years after the housing bubble burst, but that same pattern from before now worked in reverse. The first jobs went to Mexicans who'd do the work for half the price, and so the market coming back didn't mean a thing to Aiden. He was still out of work and carried all of that hatred with him as he headed up the gravel drive to the apartment building where Alberto lived.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm just grabbing the remote for the slideshow. So these are the 2 books you've published so far. Where All Light Tends to Go, which was, as I mentioned, was up for an award, and The Weight of This World, which is what you just read from. I think I should mention to the audience that part of the reason I invited you here was because I also am from Kentucky, which is a different place from where you're from, but a place that's often misunderstood, I think, or people don't understand what it's like to be from a different region of the country. And so I thought it'd be very helpful to have a perspective on life in a different part of this country. And particularly since we saw post-election a sort of misunderstanding of people who were in more liberal East Coast, West Coast locales, not understanding the appeal of Donald Trump, and that we saw that in a lot of states like North Carolina, Trump had a huge appeal. So I was wondering if we could just start with, Trump had a slogan called "Make America Great Again," and how did that appeal to people in Appalachia? How did that resonate with them?
Yeah, I think for a lot of people where jobs pulled out, so at some point when there was industry. So you know, if we're talking about the coal fields of Kentucky and West Virginia, and we're talking about coal jobs leaving, or if we're talking about where I live, it was primarily at one point in time a paper industry. You know, it was paper plants, and there were a lot of other plants. So there was a rubber plant, for instance. But so there were all these plant jobs. And you go back and you watch decade of this, and they weren't great jobs, but they were decent jobs, and they were jobs that had, you know, retirement, had benefits, and allowed these people to buy houses, and allowed them to do these things primarily without education. I think that may be key as well, is that a lot of these people may not have gone to college, and they were able to get into these jobs in plants without a degree. But so I think when you watch decades and decades of kind of this, it might not have been the American dream, but by God, it was good in their minds. You know, I might not have had excess, but I could buy beer and hot dogs. Kind of mentality. And then to watch all of the industry collapse and leave in the same way that it left you know, places like Detroit. I think for those people, when they heard "Make America Great Again," there were good old days for those people to look back on. And so as comical as that slogan may sound to people who have you know, never had anything, to those people it meant something. You know, I read something one time where it was saying, you know, it was asking, you know, how was it great for a lot of the marginalized people back then, you know, when we talk about the good old days, and it wasn't. And I think that's why that slogan is so comical to a lot of other people, is that America for them hasn't been great. There wasn't a time when the things I'm talking about existed, but for these people it did, and I think maybe that's part of it.
How can students who you know, we are on a East Coast campus with probably a majority of more liberal or Democratic-leaning students, how can we encourage empathy and openness towards these different perspectives? Because as a professor, the day after the election coming into class, I felt that my students wanted an explanation. They wanted to understand where Trump supporters were coming from. And again, this is a nonpartisan event that we sponsor here, but we like to bring in lots of different perspectives. And I think having come from a place where you were surrounded by a lot of Trump supporters, how can we encourage students to open up their minds to different perspectives?
I think an event like this is a prime example in the sense of encouraging dialogue and meaningful dialogue. When I look back at that year, I'm ashamed of some of my actions in the sense of hearing things and not having the gall and the gut to speak up because maybe it was easier. And when I'm saying this, I mean with family, I mean with friends. You know, I can remember my dad, you know, I don't know who my dad voted for. I know he hated Hillary Clinton. I don't know why. But I never, you know, when he would get to talking, I just ignore it because it was easier. Or, you know, when a friend would get to talking and say something, I would ignore it because it was easier. And looking back, that was an act of cowardice. And maybe I haven't ever really thought about that until right this second, but I think it was. And I think that it takes bravery and it takes empathy to be willing to walk into those conversations openly and want to listen to the other side in hopes that you can have a dialogue where something meaningful comes out of it. I think there's an American tendency nowadays where a lot of times people are afraid to talk to one another because nobody talks. We all scream. You know, we've created a society where the only dialogue we have are 140 character tidbits, or we post a Facebook update and either somebody likes it or they don't, but there's no type of meaningful dialogue coming out of it. In a lot of ways, we've destroyed that forum, and I think maybe, you know, working on that. You know, sitting in that class today, they all had good questions. And I learned from them and they learned from me. And that's a matter of, you know, sitting down and desiring to have that conversation.
So I think along the same lines, and I told you I'd like to bring in my students' questions into the conversation, and then we'll open it up to the audience in about 20 minutes or so. Jordan asks, you talk a lot about the sort of stigma associated with the term trailer and trailer park. If you had it your way, what would you want people to think of when they hear the word trailer, and what does the word trailer mean to you, and why is that sort of has such a negative stereotype?
Yeah, I think, so this essay was called Digging in the Trash, and the way that the essay came about was that there was a critic from Boston who didn't like my books, and that's perfectly fine. You know, my books aren't for everyone. You know, lots of people might not like my books. But he said, you need to come down out of the holler, leave the peeling trailers, and try writing about people for a change. And he italicized that word people, as if to say that the people I'm writing about and the people who come out of the holler and out of the trailers aren't human. And I felt rage. I mean, there's really no other word for it than rage. But we were having this conversation earlier, and I was talking about, you know, when you see a news story and something has taken place in a trailer park, they never say so-and-so was inside their home. That word home is left out of the conversation. They say so-and-so was inside their trailer. And for me, that is a very, very distinct difference in the language that they are choosing to use. Growing up, I had tons of friends who lived in trailers. My grandfather lived in a trailer. I knew that there were people who looked down on it, but I don't think it was something that ever came into my mind. And it was because, you know, I went in there and we played like kids play anywhere. Or I went in there and somebody's mama made me a sandwich, or we drank Kool-Aid, or, you know, whatever. We did the things that kids do, whether it's in a house or an apartment complex or wherever it is. And so for me, I grew up in a way where there was always humanity and dignity attached to that place, so that I didn't look at it with that type of negative connotation. If you hear that discussion, when people talk about trailers, when trailer parks are portrayed in whatever context, it's always in a very demeaning way. When, like, the reality is where I live, I would say 30% maybe of people in that county live in mobile homes. And part of it is out of necessity. They're cheaper. That's cheap places to live. Part of it might be that you can't build a house where they live. Lots of times, hell, it's on the side of a hill. You couldn't grade it out to put a house there. And so I think there's a lot of reasons that go into why somebody lives in a trailer. And I think we need to, when we have conversations about trailers and trailer parks and people that live in these places, it's easy. That's their home. It's no different than your house. You know, the idea that we always throw trash on the end of that phrase is, I don't know, despicable.
So a lot of the students that you met today are from the Northeast, the East Coast of this country, and even one student, Stephen, said, "I've personally never traveled further south than Richmond, Virginia." And with that said, what would you say are some of the biggest misperceptions or stereotypes that people were in the Mid-Atlantic region or people in the Northeast that we have? What are the biggest misperceptions that you perceive we have of people who are in Appalachia or in the southern states?
Racists. You know, when I think about the primary stigma attached to the American South, for decades, it's been racism. And that's not to say that racism doesn't exist in the South. It very much does. But the idea that the majority of people in the South are racist, or even if it's not the majority, that it's a really high percentage, I think is often very incorrect. And the other side of it is I've encountered racism everywhere I've ever traveled. And if you look at where hate groups exist, if you go to the Southern Poverty Law Center and look at where hate groups exist in America, they exist all over the place. And it might surprise you to get onto that list and look at that map and see somebody who's in your backyard. And so I think racism is one of it. I think that's the biggie.
Okay, thank you. So I think our students were sort of fascinated by your lifestyle in our class discussion today. And we had a pretty long conversation about gun ownership and having a gun. And I was wondering if you could elaborate upon that a little bit, because you do hunt and fish, and you mentioned that about 90% of your diet comes from hunting or from things that you've planted in your own backyard. Can you help explain what that experience is like to people who maybe are only familiar with shopping at grocery stores for their food?
Yeah, well, I think most of my life, I was like everybody else. I shopped at grocery stores, and I think there for a while I went full-blown vegetarian, and so I started really thinking about eating more responsibly then, But so really how it came about was just the idea of trying to take responsibility for where my food comes from, knowing where my food comes from. I also think that there's something really special about being that tied to your food source in a way that our culture has gotten away from. Most people, there's a lot of people in this room, especially the students, who may have never eaten anything where they knew where it came from, aside from the grocery store, or in some fancy ass restaurant where they say locally, grown, whatever. Oh, it came from down here, but they've never seen where that meat came from. And I think our culture has lost a lot because of that shift. I think of a writer like Wendell Berry. I think that's a lot of what Wendell has been preaching since the 70s. I think he had solutions to a lot of the things that we've seen in his desire for us to move back to those types of communities. And so for me, it's about that. It's about being tied to that place. It's about taking responsibility for that act. It's about when I eat a meal, we typically eat about 2 deer a year. The deer we've been eating on, I can remember the last steps that animal took. And there is an immense reverie attached to that. And every time I eat it, I'm incredibly thankful. And so I think, that type of relationship with the land and that type of relationship with the environment is something that's very valuable to me.
So we got a question from Twitter. We have some questions coming in from Twitter. From someone named Phoebe. How do you feel about the recent removals of Confederate monuments in the South?
Yeah, I think, we're seeing that right now in where I live in downtown Silva. There's a monument that overlooks what stands at the courthouse, but the courthouse is up on a hill, so it overlooks the whole town. You can't be in downtown Silva and not see that statue. At the same time, I don't necessarily think a lot of people think about it, but regardless, it's there, and it was put there with a pretty clear intention. I find myself really torn, and I think I've found it hard to have this conversation, and part of it is there is a pride in where I come from. I know the names of my Confederate ancestors, and that was instilled in me all my life. They were they were all poor sharecroppers. None of them were slave owners. They were all very poor sharecroppers. But I think what a lot of people who are like me are missing is that you can have a pride in where you come from and still reach an understanding that what was going on during that time was wrong. The reason that war was fought primarily was wrong. And I think a lot of people aren't willing to recognize that just yet. And so I think that's where this conversation is kind of coming from, and that's where the clash is happening. At the same time, in places like where I live, what I would really like to see happen is I would like to see them put it on a ballot. And I think that's a responsible way for politicians and communities to address it, is that then there's no, shit on your shoes, for lack of a better way of putting it. Is if you say, all right, we understand that there's a whole lot of people in the community who want this gone. We understand there's a whole lot who don't. And you put options out there, and maybe the option is to move it into a museum, or maybe the option is to take it down completely. But then you try and create a forum where people can have a dialogue and a say without standing in front of it at each other's throat, with some people tearing it down and some people reaching for their guns. I think, in a lot of ways, that's the local government's fault for allowing that type of thing to happen.
So we've seen a lot of removals of Confederate statues over just the past year, particularly since Charlottesville, the Charlottesville protest. And a lot of communities are doing this sort of in the secret of night, kind of going in. So you're suggesting that's not probably the best way to deal with it?
No, I don't think vandalism's ever the right way to handle something. And I think in a lot of ways, the people who are standing there waving Confederate flags, a lot of times that just is fuel for the fire for them. And so I think there are more responsible ways to address it. And I'm wholeheartedly agree with removing these statues. You look at the history of when they were put up, and it is impossible to deny why they were put there. And so you look at the facts and you look at the history, and it's pretty clear cut. But at the same time, I think there's always a responsible way to try and progress. And I don't necessarily think that vandalism and chaos is going to help things.
Well, I want to get back to a question from a student in my class, Kelly, who I should admit that we've all been following you on Twitter, so we're paying attention to the things that you're tweeting about and your Instagram, which is mostly, as we discovered, big fish and hunting with your dog. But a student, Kelly, noticed that you tweeted last week about how your lifestyle is drastically different from 99% of Americans, judging from their conversations. And she was wondering sort of what motivated that or where that came from. Are you talking from your, as a writer, or from someone who's from this more rural background?
Well, it was in an airport. It was yesterday, I think. But I was
it was yesterday.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure. I was listening to these two people, and one of them was having a conversation about a new Kroger in his neighborhood, and you know, if it wasn't for this Kroger, he doesn't know how he lived before Kroger. And before this Kroger existed, and he got his Kroger credit card, and he could walk out his door and shop at the Kroger, you know, life was hard.
And Kroger, I should say, is Acme, basically, for not, we don't have Kroger up here.
Okay, I guess it's like Winn-Dixie or
yeah.
But so I was listening to that, and I was thinking, you know, I typically don't talk anyway, so most of my time is spent listening. But I listen to things like that, and I just think how different my life is from kind of a city life. And how incredibly grateful I am for that. You know, I love the lifestyle that I live, and I couldn't imagine it being any other way. But yeah, I think the majority of this nation is kind of moving towards a more urban lifestyle, and I'm not cut out for it.
Well, and I do appreciate your appearance here. I read somewhere you had written that you'd be happy never traveling 500 miles outside of your home, and I looked it up, we're about 630 miles, yeah. So I appreciate you bridging that divide there. Let's get back to your writing a little bit. A lot of my students, and we've got a question from Twitter that asks, you base a lot of your characters on people that you know, people that you've grown up with. Is it emotionally difficult writing your novels since they're based on friends and experiences that you've had?
Well, I don't know that none of my characters have ever been based off of people I know. There are events that really make me think about things. And so for instance, with The Weight of This World, one event is in the very opening page. This child witnesses his father murder his mother and commit suicide. That happened, you know, just a few doors down from my parents' house. And when my mom told me that, all I could wonder was, you know, what is going to happen to that kid? And and that question just evolved and evolved. And so part of that story came from there. The other side is with the character of Thad, and I think maybe that's what this person's referring to. And I had a really good friend named Paco, grew up with, you know, had lots of good times with. Loved him to death, and he joined the military at some point. He was in multiple deployments in Iraq, and I don't know what he saw there. I know photographs I saw, and so for instance, I saw pictures of him with two prisoners with black bags over their faces, and him standing there with his thumbs up like the Fonz, them on their knees. What I do know is that when he came home, he walked into his house one day and he shot his brother and he shot his father and he killed himself. And I can remember the way that was portrayed on the news. And I can remember the way that in that story, he was completely stripped of his humanity. And that greatly bothered me. And I think really if we get to the root of most of my writing, that's what I'm doing, is I'm trying to go to the darkest places imaginable and find humanity. And so with this character in this novel, I'd been reading a lot of things. I was reading books like Sebastian Junger's War, or David Grossman's On Killing. I was reading a whole lot of, you know, war literature. I was also following a whole lot of things. So, for instance, there was this British Marine who had massacred these people in this town, and I was going through these transcripts of his defense, and part of the defense was all the things that he had seen, and how it had conditioned this in him. And I mean things like dismembered bodies hung up in trees like wind chimes. And I just remember thinking, you know, how much all of that had to have weighed on him. And I think so kind of all of that kind of, you know, melded into what became the character of Thad Broom in this story. I think that's indicative of most, probably most fiction writers anyways, but especially, you know, I can speak for myself and say it's true for me in that most everything I write is kind of a collective of, you know, all different things that I pick up, different mannerisms that people do, little, you know, little anecdotes people say. And so it all kinds of just comes together.
Well, I have up here, you tweeted, I think this was last week, September 15th, you were looking through the galley pages for your next novel. Can you tell us a little bit about what that's about?
Yeah, I think I always say that there's like a trigger event, and all my novels have something that kind of at the very beginning kicks everything off. And with this novel, it was a guy had been hunting. It's getting late in the evening. He can't see real well, but he hears something across the cove. He looks through the scope, and he thinks he sees a pig. And so he shoots this pig. And when he gets up to it, it was a man digging ginseng, poaching ginseng, and which has happened right there in Macon County. A game warden had told me that story. But so I was kind of wondering, you know, about that, and so I kind of made the guy that he had killed kind of from this notorious family. And so this guy's brother winds up kind of finding out. He knows that his brother's missing, but, you know, he kind of winds up following a blood trail, and that's really how the book starts. It's another feel-good book.
Another thing that came up in class today and that we've talked about throughout the day is the opioid epidemic that's sweeping the nation, but that, you know, there has been a drug epidemic in Appalachia and in rural Southern America for a long time. What are your thoughts on what the government or what should be done to kind of tackle these issues of increased drug use that you write about in your books and the crime that goes along with that?
Yeah, I think my only thing I would alter about that statement is I don't think that there's a drug epidemic directly tied to Appalachia. I think there's a drug epidemic that has been sweeping across this country for decades and decades and decades. One of the things that we talked about earlier in that class was that this is a more recent conversation, and in my opinion, the reason that it's a more recent conversation is because suddenly you have middle class and upper class white kids and their parents who are facing this, you know. And until heroin reached those communities, it was a conversation that most people didn't want to have because it didn't affect them. And so I think that's part of what we're witnessing as far as why the conversation is starting to take place. And that's a good thing that the conversation is starting to take place. But the reality is that, you know, the people who have been facing the drug epidemic and bearing that burden for decades have been people of poverty. Lots of times people of color, but most often marginalized people in general. And I think when we look at you know, what has happened, I think there's two things that need to be done, and one thing is that the conversation we keep having is the idea of drugs being brought into this country, and it's a conversation where it's like, you know, where we can build a wall and by God we'll fix it. Well, number one, that's just lunacy. That's not true. But the other side of that is that I don't think that's the right conversation. The conversation that we never have is about big pharma. It's about pharmaceutical companies who for decades have handed out prescription drugs to everybody under the sun, especially people of poverty. You know, and That's what we're witnessing. We are witnessing the effect of a culture who has been sedated and drugged for decades. And that's the reason it's reaching these people. I think of, my mom, when my mom fell and broke her wrist one time, she goes, they fill up a bottle with Oxycontin. That's the conversation that we need to have. And the reason that they don't want to have that conversation is that's where the money's coming from. And so, when I was saying that I think we're having the wrong conversation, that's what I mean. The other thing that we're witnessing is people pulling all of the funding out of the resources. Somebody in your class was talking about a friend of theirs who was being sent to rehab down in Florida, or no, it was her brother working at a rehab facility in Florida. And that basically the only people who could get to these facilities are for the most part, upper middle class and upper class white families. They're the only ones who could afford it. And so you have facilities available, but they're only available if you can pay. The facilities we do have that have served communities, and particularly lower class communities, they're losing funding. They're pulling all of the money out of that. And what I was telling those students earlier is that one way or another you're going to pay for it. As a taxpayer, you're going to pay for it. The one way you pay for it is throwing them in jail. The other way you pay for it is with some type of treatment. And in my mind, one is a whole hell of a lot more constructive than the other. And I know if I could, get my tax dollars to go some way, I'd much rather get my tax dollars going somewhere where hopefully we can address an issue and try to help somebody, rather than put them in a situation that's only going to worsen, that reality.
Well, I've got one more question from Twitter before we literally toss the questions to the audience here. So I'll ask Katie and Sarandu to meet with Nancy and kind of get that catch box set up and ready to go for us to have a Q&A. But this question came from Sean on Twitter, and I think it really hits at the heart of the purpose of this series. He says, how do we validate the struggle people feel while also potentially challenging their perspective? How do we maintain that empathy while also trying to persuade or to influence?
I think there's it's really I was laughing earlier because I'm a walking, talking contradiction. People look at me and they would think a very certain thing about me. And I was joking about how if you could guess what book I had in my bag, it probably wouldn't be that I'd been sitting there reading Thich Nhat Hanh all day. But I have, that's what I spend all day reading. But I think like somebody like Thich Nhat Hanh, and I think about active listening. And I think that's key. And I think...
And this we should explain for those of you who don't know, it's a Buddhist writer who...
Kind of just a philosopher, but I think what I witness a lot of times nowadays is that when we're having a conversation, people aren't actually listening to what the other person's saying. They're actually waiting for their moment to speak. Because in their mind, I already know what he's going to say, and I have a response, and that's what they're focused on. They're focused on the response. They're not focused on the listening. And so I think, number one, I think when you go into any type of dialogue, especially when you're talking about a dialogue where there is going to be difference, where there is going to be two sides, and we are not in agreement, I think you have to go into it with a very open mind. And your hands like this. And so I think through active listening and through sitting there and letting somebody pour themselves onto you, I think by that very process, you were going to open something up in them. So that by them feeling valuable and by them feeling listened to, they almost feel obligated to return that favor, and so then, then's your time to talk, and I think if we can get to a place where people are able to have constructive conversations again. I think that's one of the greatest things that has disappeared from this country, is that everybody is angry. You experience it even on the highway in the driving. Everybody is at each other's throats. And when you walk into a conversation like that, nothing constructive is happening, nothing. It's like arguing with a 5-year-old, or it's like that metaphor of playing chess with a pigeon, and at the end of it doesn't matter if you win the game of chess, the pigeon's still going to shit on the board and strut around. And I think that's true. I think that's true, and I think that comes out of the fact that we're all just coming in with so much emotion. And I think one of the best things we can do is take a step back and say, I'm gonna approach this differently. And part of that is trying to create a moment of community, but part of that is also can be selfish. It can be, this is the most constructive way for me to try to get my point across, and that's okay.
All right, well, I think then in that light, we should listen to some folks in the audience and see what perspectives they have. So thank you, Katie and Sarandu. They're gonna come up to the front of the room here. And if you just wanna raise your hand, we are literally gonna try and throw this thing around the room and answer some questions. So who has the first question?
There's a gentleman right there.
Oh, I see,
Yeah.
right over there. Can you do it? She's walking it over.
Throw it. Do
I kind of want to see her throw this box.
Oh, good job.
Do I just talk into the box?
I can hear you.
Yes, exactly.
I particularly enjoyed the voice you have in your novels. I'll have to admit I have some prejudice. I wonder where you found that voice in Appalachia. What are the schools like there?
Do you mean the language of the writing style?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. I didn't know if you meant that or my accent.
No. I mean the song you sing.
Oh, thank you.
I'll put it another way.
Yeah. I think that's a great way to put it. I think of, my biggest influences have been writers like, one of my mentors is Ron Rash. I think Ron Rash writes some of the richest, most beautiful prose in America. He's a poet at heart, and to hear him read and to spend time with him and that attention to detail, I think that's a big part of it. He talks about, and this is how nerdy he is, he talks about enjoying the way that consonants and vowels rub against each other in a sentence. That sounds like lunacy to somebody who doesn't get off on those things, but that's exactly right. I think when I get to a sentence, especially when a sentence is working, the thing that makes me happiest is the rhythm of it, and it's the music of it. And I think that's what made writers like Larry Brown and William Gay really stand apart, was even Cormac McCarthy. I think a lot of these writers are coming out of him. But there's a very, very close attention to language. And at the end of the day, that's what I'm most interested in, is the language. And I think, I don't know, it just makes me happy. I don't know of anything that makes me happier than when a sentence is working.
I think the question was more, coming from a different background, what are the schools like there? Were you encouraged by a particular teacher? Was there a writing program that?
Yeah, okay, yeah. I went to Western Carolina University, which is in Cullowhee, in Jackson County. Ron Rash is an instructor there. So I mean, we've got probably the undisputed king of Appalachian literature there. And so I think that's a big part of it. He was a teacher of mine. I think really my biggest influence was a professor named Deidre Elliott, and she was the one who in that essay was from out west, who said she felt strangled by the trees. But she was a beautiful essayist. Some of the best essays I've ever read were written by her. But I think she really encouraged me. I think she spent a lot more time with me than she had to. And so really at the end of the day, when I think about who I owe it to the most, as far as, not as far as where the storytelling comes from, and not as far as where my desire to write comes from, but where the real honing of craft took place, it took place with her. I owe everything to her.
Well, I think it's worth noting, we had a conversation earlier about how you were writing before you could spell, that this is something that you've enjoyed from the time of early childhood.
Yeah, I think, well, I think that's true of most artists. I think artists, you know, lots of people think, oh, I think it might be fun to paint, or I think it might be fun to write a story. Well, there's a drastic difference between somebody who wants to do something and somebody who feels compelled to do so. And so for me, I think there was always a very deliberate compulsion. I couldn't avoid it. If nothing had ever been published, I would still do it. Those novels would still exist. They would be in a drawer, but they would still exist because I felt compelled to do that. I don't get that type of enjoyment out of much. Maybe fishing.
All right, let's have another question from the audience. Right over here, if you can toss it over, Katie, and then we will hand it over to Sarando. Oh, perfect.
That was a pretty good catch.
It's called a body catch. I could be wrong about this, but it strikes me that so many people in the North don't go to the South. And I went to school in North Carolina, so I know it's a really fine state, and I still have relatives in the western part. But what in your mind would make, in order to bridge this gap of differences that people feel, what would it take to make Northerners or Midwesterners or whatever go to the South and experience some of the culture that's there?
I think what brings people to a place like where I live is
I'm going to pause you just for a second because I wanted to put up a tweet that is related to your conversation. There's an irony in outsiders flocking to the mountains to witness an eclipse, a metaphor in coming to Appalachia just to stay in the dark. Because you were in the heart of this eclipse that came about a month or so ago. And you remarked today about people coming to visit to just sort of witness it and then leave.
Yeah.
So
I think what brings people to the I didn't even know people read the stuff I tweeted.
I told you, I've been following you.
It's haunting me. No, I think a lot of people come to the mountains for the natural beauty. You know, I think that's what brings people there. I've traveled all over this country, and there have only ever been 2 other places that I've ever been where the landscape felt that overpowering. You know, you live in a place like where I live, you cannot ignore what's around you. I mean, I look out my window and I'm surrounded. And so I think there's that. As far as, and so I think that there are a lot of people who come from the north to Appalachia and to North Carolina. I think that's largely why they come. Here's the problem, is that, so we have a giant influx of people who move here, move to Jackson County, putting in second, third homes, and typically their license plates say Florida, but they're not really from Florida. They're from you know, New York or somewhere else. They move down to Florida, and then now they're in the mountains. The problem with the way that those people interact with locals is that they come into the conversation with an immense air of superiority, as stand back boys, I'm bringing big city brains to the holler. Like that's kind of how the conversation starts. And I think the minute that a conversation starts that way, those people become incredibly skeptical. And so, you know, I think a lot of people come there and they want to change things. And the thing is, these people are happy. They're happy with a lot of the way things are, and that's not to say that there can't be a lot of improvements, you know, with diversity, or with resources, or with jobs. But that is to say that culturally, I don't know that people there want to be changed. Culturally, we are very happy. I could make a single phone call and I could have whatever resources I needed at my house immediately. There is still that type of sense of community there. Those people would lay down their lives for their neighbors. And that is a type of thing that does not exist very many places in this country anymore. And so I think largely when people do come to areas like this, they need to understand that life has been going on there for a long time. You know, and people have a way of getting by, and if you can watch that and you can embrace it, by simply embracing things, it's going to open up an avenue for conversation, and suddenly, you know, things that really do need to change, things like you know, diversity, or things like jobs, or any land development, anything else. Suddenly there's an avenue for that conversation. You know, again, it goes back to us not being, you know, butting up against each other.
Another question from the audience, maybe from over on this side of the room.
Anyone?
Right here?
Okay. You ready for it?
Thank you, and thank you for being here. You write a lot about people that are under economic stress, that occupy a certain geography, but how would you compare or contrast this to people in other parts of the world that face economic stress or have maybe similar experiences because of that?
In other parts of the world, or in other parts of the country?
No, other parts of the world. I mean, this is not a unique human condition that you find in Appalachia. Yeah,
I think I would have a hard time making comparisons globally, one, out of sheer ignorance, in the sense that I wouldn't want to speak out of turn. The other thing, though, is that I think that what happens in this country, for the most part, is a very, very unique and American identity. Culturally, we are vastly different from most of the rest of the world. You know, just with everything, just with our mentality, and so I think I would have a hard time making that comparison. I can make that comparison within this country, though, and thinking about, and so when we talk about people in Appalachia, you know, we want to make them very, very different than people in an inner city or something like that, and I don't necessarily think that's true. I was having a conversation recently. There's a really great movement happening in Appalachia called the Afro-Latin Artist Project, where a lot of African American artists are really pushing work out of that region and saying, we are here. And so that we get great artists like Marie Cochran and Frank X. Walker, and a lot of great folks. But anyways, me and Marie Cochran went to lunch, and we went to lunch with this lady named Selma Sparks. And Selma Sparks was a civil rights activist back in the 60s. She was from, I think she was from Harlem. But she led the march to the United Nations building in New York. But she was also the only female ever granted an interview with Malcolm X at Liberator magazine. She worked alongside James Baldwin. This woman lives in Franklin, North Carolina, in the middle of the mountains, which is bizarre to me, how the hell she wound up there. But when I was sitting there with her, what blew me away were all of the similarities with the issues, and a lot of what she said was that was one of the biggest mistakes of in her mind, the civil rights movement, and particularly this last election was not going into places and getting them to recognize that at the end of the day they're wanting the same things, and that the same things are happening to them. And so you read a lot nowadays about gentrification in cities, and people, especially African American communities, being forced out of places where they've lived for generations, being forced out of these places by white people wanting to live closer to the city. That same thing is happening in Appalachia. You've got an influx of outsiders going into places, buying up land, skyrocketing land prices, and we call it land rich because you might have 200 acres that's been passed down generation to generation, but you're so poor you can't pay the taxes on it. And so with an idea like even gentrification, you know, when we have that conversation, we have it about inner cities, we don't have it about Appalachia, but poverty's poverty. And I think when you start to look at it that way, you realize that the same issues are facing people regardless of where they're coming from. If you're poor, it's the same things. These are marginalized people. And I think if we can reach a place where that becomes a unifying theme, look the hell out, you know. I think you could make a lot of progress in a moment like that.
All right, there's another question over on the side there, Sarandu. Yeah, go ahead and toss it. Oh!
Thank you.
There we go.
In listening to what you speak, I come from a construction background, so I understand the how jobs kind of changed and things like that. But what can Appalachia teach us? Because you've talked about the similarities. You've talked about poverty being poverty. You've talked about the needs that everybody faces, whether you're in Delaware, whether you're in Vermont, whether you're in Idaho. What can Appalachia, what can you as a writer and Appalachia as an area teach the rest of this country as far as civility, getting together? You mentioned community and being there, but what can you teach us? Because it seems like you say, we go there to change you.
Yep.
What can you do to say, this is what you need to recognize?
Yeah.
Good question.
I think one is resilience. I think when you look at the Appalachian people, you look at people who have been exploited from the very beginning of that history. And so in the very beginnings it was timber, and when the timber was gone in a lot of places it was coal, or in a place like mine it was unrestricted land development. And you've always had big money interests come in and exploit the place, and then when everything was gone they left. But through all of that, there's been a very resilient population of people who have survived. And so I think one of those things is just that dire sense of survival. I think the other, when I think of the most important writer alive in America, I don't know that I could think of anybody more important than Wendell Berry. I think Wendell Berry I think he's the greatest American writer alive. And if you look at everything that Wendell has written out of Kentucky since, you know, the late 60s, early 70s, what he has consistently said is that we need to get back to communities where we take care of ourselves. He very much believes in kind of an agricultural type of society. But when I look at a lot of the things that happen, I think that's something to learn. I think there's something incredibly valuable about that type of lifestyle. And the more that this country, becomes urbanized, and the more people move away from that type of culture, I think it's been devastating. I think it's created an immense sense of loneliness. People don't feel tied to the place they're around. People don't feel tied to the land. People where I live do. And I think that's an incredibly valuable thing. I think that sense of community and that value for the land are incredible values to take away.
Thank you. That was great. Another question. Okay, we might have to get it all the way over to the complete opposite side of the auditorium. Do you think you can toss it? Try it.
That's a long toss.
I can get it to the end of the row.
It'll get there eventually.
Oh, yes, it will.
I think it's like a beach ball.
Yeah.
Like you're supposed to just
There you
toss it
go.
around.
All right, let's keep it going. Oh, here we go.
Oh, I like this.
All right.
That was a good toss.
Nice job.
He wins a free book. At the end, you should come up and I will give you a copy of this book for that toss.
Wow.
Deal.
Good for you.
All right, so I wanted to ask you, because a lot of the things that you've mentioned in your readings and in just talking and in answering questions has to do with human transformations, or sometimes the resistance to transforming. You talk about how when you were younger, you went to your friend's house, whatever kind of house it was, whether it was a field or a house or a trailer, and you ate food with your family, and you enjoyed life, and you didn't think anything of it. And how when people get older, they get angrier, they get stubborner. They have preconceived notions about how society should work, how they can improve an area without talking to people there. In your travels and hearing these stories, have you sort of identified a point in someone's life where this change occurs? And have you thought about how we as a society can reach people before they become angry and stubborn and set in their ways, and then try to broaden their perspective?
Yeah, well, I don't know that I've put a lot of thought into that, but I will tell you a tweet that I read today. And it was in a series of tweets from the Southern Poverty Law Center, and it was talking about the primary agenda of the alt-right, and it was Richard Spencer. And Richard Spencer had made a quote that the place to target people was universities. And his reasoning for that was that he felt that was the most moldable time in a person's life. That once they got out of that environment, they were pretty much set in their ways at that point. And so I think there's a lot of value to that. I think he's probably, in a lot of ways, he might be right. Luckily, we've got a whole hell of a lot of people working hard in universities to kind of combat that. But yeah, I think the way that you've always been able to transform a society is through education, and maybe education is the biggest thing that's under attack under the administration that we're currently facing. The shift to want to privatize public education, the complete dismantling of the public education system in America, that will be devastating in places like Appalachia. It'll be places, in any place where you have a marginalized people, and so I think that's key. I'm talking education from the ground up, from the moment you enter school through college. I think that's really the place where those types of changes happen. And after that, it really, I think in some ways that comment by Richard Spencer, he's probably right. There probably does come a time when you leave and you're living your life and you're kind of tied down to that, whatever that belief system you've developed is. And so I think that's what we need to look at. I think we need to look very hard at the education system in this country and try to figure out a way, whatever that may be, to make that better. And then other things that we need to be supporting our teachers. We need to be putting good teachers in those places. They can't keep teachers in the county where I live. The pay is so horrible that those people cannot afford to drive there. to those schools and teach. They can't afford it. And so I think as a country, we have to completely change the way that we even think about that. We have to think about what do we want to value, and we need to come up with if it's education, then great. And when you come up with a certain group of things that you value, then you say that's where I want my money to go. If at the end of the day that's where my tax dollars go, take it. I'm happy. And so I think that's kind of a roundabout answer to your question.
Well, and I hope that that's what we're fostering here with this audience in this place over the course of every fall semester, is having dialogues that might not be easy, but they help us see different perspectives. And I think you're right that college age is a really fundamental period of discovery for young people. So I really appreciate you all being here. I want to give you a couple of announcements before we thank David for being here. Our next speaker is 2 weeks from today, Wednesday, October 4th. We'll be featuring an NPR correspondent, Asma Khalid. She covered the 2016 election by traveling across the country and interviewing people from all different spectrums, all different parts of the world, all while being Muslim. And she actually has an article that she wrote that said, covering the campaign while being Muslim. So she should offer a very interesting perspective for us. I also wanted to remind you about the audio essay contest that I mentioned earlier. This is open to all University of Delaware students. The deadline is December 1st. It's a great opportunity to share your perspective and to potentially, win some cash prizes. So I want to thank you all for being here, and please give us a great round of applause to David Joy.
Thank you.